Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is ArtNet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news, expertly compiled by the ArtNet Pro editorial team.
Hi, I'm Andrew Goldstein, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News where the art world meets the real world, bringing each week's biggest story down to earth. Woohoo! We did it! 2021. Well done, everybody. We made it through that horrible year. Okay, now on to the next one. This week, the Art Angle team is taking it easy to get a little R&R before diving back into the fray for the year ahead. But in the meantime, we thought we'd leave you with one of our favorite episodes of 2020, a contemplative conversation about art and life between ArtNet News chief critic Ben Davis and the incomparable New Yorker art critic Peter Schjeldahl. We hope you enjoy it and wish you a very happy New Year all around.
I think that if art is worth writing about, there's always a point of mystery about it. Mm-hmm. And it's finding that point that interests me.
Hi, I'm Andrew Goldstein, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News where the art world meets the real world, bringing each week's biggest story down to earth. These days, with everything upended by the ongoing pandemic, some people might be wondering, why does art matter so much in this crazy world of ours? This is a question that the legendary art critic Peter Schjeldahl has been asking and answering for years. Born in Fargo, North Dakota in 1942, Schjeldahl has been an art critic since the mid-1960s and has spent the past 22 years at the New Yorker magazine, where he's valiantly defended the notions of beauty and authenticity in art against the relentless forces of cynicism and the ersatz. He has published several volumes of postmodern poetry, as well as books of his criticism, most recently in last year's remarkable collection, Hot, Cold, Heavy, Light. This past year has been an unspeakably difficult time for Schjeldahl, who was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer last September, and then endured a fire at his home of 47 years that destroyed all of his papers. Miraculously, his cancer has since gone into remission, just in time for a COVID-19 pandemic to throw the world into lockdown. Throughout it all, Schjeldahl has held fast to his unshakable faith in art, writing movingly about its consolations in the New Yorker, and more recently, about the enduring power of the old masters in times of crisis. For this week's episode of The Art Angle, ArtNet News chief art critic Ben Davis sat down with Peter Schjeldahl, via Zoom of course, to talk about art's value in times of trouble, among other things. This, I should mention, is a rare treat for listeners. In a survey ranking the world's most influential art critics, Schjeldahl came in at number 4, Ben at number 5. Let's hear what they have to say.
So I'm here talking with Peter Schjeldahl, who is one of the most respected art critics in the world, and it's a great honor to get a chance to talk to him. Peter, where are you right now?
I'm in a little town in the Catskills called Bovina. We have a house in a mountain valley up here where we've been coming up here for 40-some years, and now we are, I guess, permanent residents.
Sure, you're stuck up there. We're all stuck in place. Sort of, the world is frozen in place.
Uh-huh.
I thought I'd just start with the most basic general interest question. How did you end up as an art critic?
The way everybody used to, by accident. I grew up in small towns in the Midwest. Went to college, dropped out of college. This is the early 60s. Managed by very strange luck to get a job as a newspaper reporter in Jersey City. And I was a poet, and I got into the poetry world in Manhattan. So starting in 1965, I started writing for Art News because all the poets wrote art criticism in those days.
Poet critic was kind of the main model of being a critic then.
Well, I mean, it was barely a professional designation. I mean, nobody went to school for it. New York magazines, wanted people who could write. And I had never taken an art course. I have a high school diploma as my highest achievement. But it took, and here it is, 55 years later.
Did you approach it as like a poetic project to begin with?
Well, art is an attitude toward materials. My material is language.
Mm-hmm.
I got very excited. I was in New York in the 60s. Everything was happening. And we didn't sleep very much. And went everywhere, saw everything, and made every conceivable mistake. And then met our various destinies.
I say everything was happening, and I guess my question is, did it feel like that when you were there? Do you know that when it's happening?
Oh, no, I think we knew. I think it was a sense that we were an incredibly lucky generation. We were right on time. But when Andy Warhol started being mentioned in gossip columns, like in the New York Post, I started clipping them out, that they were signs of something happening in the wider culture, until one day, with a needle lawnmower, it exploded.
Yeah, you couldn't escape Warhol.
Well, it was in the tail end of abstract expressionism, which was a kind of national triumph, right, following the victory in the Second World War. It was the Kennedy years, and there was an arrogance that just seemed unarguable. As this Midwestern kid from small towns, I felt I had been elevated to the court.
In fact, the very first column included in your recent book is this 1989 essay about Andy Warhol, and it's a review of a Warhol show, but it's also a personal narrative about your first encounter with Warhol's flower paintings and how your rapturous reaction to them basically called you into a life in the New York art world. And that is very striking because Warhol's an artist that I think probably most people associate with a certain kind of cool, with surfaces, with a certain deadpan sensibility, but not maybe rapturous, transformative, life-changing depths of feeling.
No. He was an artist of cunning genius. But it was a social, historical phenomenon. And he sized up what the culture was and where it was going and became the laureate of it. It was revelatory. His relation to painting, first of all, he was a great painter. Mm-hmm. But in a way that, like everything about him, was almost incredibly efficient. He understood abstract expressionism, and what he did was essentially take the format of Barnett Newman and put Elvis Presley on it. Boom. One-stop shopping, particularly his earlier paintings, the early 60s. I mean, they're sublime. You walk into a room with them and you are riveted and pleased and excited. Intellectually, we still had the overhang of the Depression and also the whole debate of high versus low, of serious culture versus trivia. And those distinctions simply didn't exist for Andy because, and this is the analysis that I made, which seems so obvious, is that he came from the bottom of society, from the lower, working class, and actually zoomed to the top. There was nothing even remotely middle class about Andy Warhol. And what he beamed from the top were the sorts of things that he had grown up with. Tabloids, movie stars, grocery store consumerism. And people were looking for the irony. Andy Warhol had no irony.
Right.
Irony is a breathing apparatus for us middle-classniks because we're subject to conflicts on every level. It's a complicated life, but his life was always simple. He was really, really poor, and then it was a few years of precarious, and then he was really, really rich, and he understood both conditions without bothering to have an opinion about them.
I'm sort of just now putting it together, but it is like when I read that essay and think of how it kind of surprises me in a way, and It's this question of irony. I feel like that's real key for you. That a lot of the things you dislike are things that are kind of bracketed and arch and.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I guess I'm interested in authenticity, and it's always a surprise. I mean, when something's authentic, you can't plug it in to something that's already there. You've got to rearrange things to make room for it.
I think the classic Peter Schjeldahl formula is that you start by setting the scene of the show that's happening now. You pass through biography. There'll be some informed skepticism about the heroic character of the artist, both to inform a sense of what's going on and also to set off the assessment of the object from museum myth-making. And then there's some assessment of the relative quality of specific works or bodies of work, which brings you back to description of your own subjective experience and your relationship to the art personally. And you arrive through that at an observation or thought about what it means in the world right now. And that all happens fast in the space of about 1,800 words.
Well, it's a kind of, I mean, I do regard what I do as a species of literature, but it's art criticism. It comes after the art. It's a form of writing, and it engages me, and that I found I could bring a lot of different stuff into. In terms of the personal, being abysmally ignorant, and self-educating, I think I quickly understood that the only thing in the world in which I am the world's leading expert is my experience. So the pronoun I came in pretty early.
Something that I really notice when I read a lot of your writing back to back is that there's a lot of embodied description in it. Art is always making you want to slap your forehead or flee the room. And it really strikes me that you're not just talking about what the art does, but what the art does to you.
I mean, something I was thinking about, we're all isolated with the coronavirus, is that deprived of physical contact with each other and of free-ranging physical contact with the world, it is a very dire spiritual condition and consequence. Yeah. And one thing I'm always fascinated on, particularly painting and sculpture for, is that they are physical. They are literal. They are material, as we are. Mm-hmm. And a proper experience of them is in person, as a body to body. I mean, painting is the exercise of our most powerful sense, which is sight, and our greatest physical aptitude, which is the hand. It's the hand and eye connecting through an object. And being in that situation, that's why I use the first person, because I'm really telling a story of my presence in that situation. It's not a matter of authority, it's a matter of exposure.
It's a slightly different way than maybe people get trained to write about art, which is sort of almost like a third-person narration.
I think that if art is worth writing about, there's always a point of mystery about it. And it's finding that point that interests me. I write very little negative criticism, except when the occasion seems to demand it.
In a way, the idea of first-person driven, writerly art criticism went against the grain of the times you were coming up in as an art critic, in the sense that was when art criticism in general became more academic and more theory-driven.
I was untrained. I was naive. I didn't know how to do that stuff. And I found out how I like to write, but what people like to read of what I wrote. And to have a career as an artist or a writer is a collaboration with your audience. I mean, you form each other.
Yeah, it's almost like, there was a reformation of art. Like, it needs to be severe and this kind of break with the poetic dimension.
Well, that was like I think I arrived just before that kicked in the middle 60s. It was minimalism. So I still had a little bit of connection to the romantic, which, by the way, I think romanticism is the default setting of Western cultural minds, and to such an extent that we don't even realize it. You know, the kind of minimalist, heavy. I remember going to Max's Kansas City, and the minimalists hung out in front around the bar, and were really dour and kind of scary. And the Warhol people were in back. And I said it was like walking through heavy metal to get to strawberry shortcake. And I would go to the Warhol people, even though, I mean, I don't feel like I've ever fit in anywhere with any group. And not because I didn't want to, it's not my temperament.
One thing I really appreciate in your writing is that you don't begin from the premise that much of anything in art has been settled.
Yeah, there are big questions about art that it's always assumed that they've been answered and that we can just move on. But in fact, art keeps raising absolutely essential, existential, metaphysical questions that are never settled. And something interesting happens in art because one of those questions is being brought back to life. I guess, I have a combination of romanticism and skepticism, which like a tag team.
Yeah, a tag team. I mean, I highlighted this passage in your essay about Vincent van Gogh, I think from 1987, where you say, "Oh, lighten up, Vincent. I've felt at times. It's only art." You know,
it's a game. It's a game. We're not curing cancer. We're not establishing world peace. We're not spreading justice through the world. You know, it's entirely subjective, weirdly institutionally framed, commercially embedded relation with stuff. I think it's quite remarkable what kind of experience and knowledge and wisdom can emerge from that. But if you go in on your knees with reverence, you're not going to get a thing. You know, I mean, I can walk up to art and see if I can't destroy it, if I can't, think it to nothing. And then if I can't do that, things get interesting. With my best effort to be a skeptic and a cynic fail, then we can sit down and talk.
There's a passage in one of the things you write about the artist and the critic. You say, "Closeness is impossible between an artist and a critic. Each wants from the other something, the artist's mojo, the critic's sagacity, that belongs strictly to the audience for their respective work." And I guess I really identified with that.
It was something I discovered through hard experience. I mean, when I was starting, I thought my basic emotional drive was to get close to artists and, kind of worship at their shrines and be their friends. And, and I was. I mean, I had a lot of friendships. None of them lasted because I hung out with artists, drank with artists, slept with artists, and it always led to what we've come to call a codependent collapse. I mean, basically, they didn't have available to me what I wanted, and I didn't have available to them what they wanted. So eventually we fell apart.
It's a funny thing that there are these distinct roles and fundamentally different ways of looking at art that are in conflict and even have to be in tension if everything is working right. But at the same time, it's the sense of a community, the sense that there is a scene that draws a lot of artists and writers to art in the first place.
If you don't come up through a scene, you're never going to be anything but a hack or an academic. I mean, even the sort of disasters and upsets and disappointments that attend, life in a scene, that is prime information. And if you haven't lived it, you don't have it. I mean, it constitutes sophistication. All right, knowledge you can click up on Google, but sophistication is distilled from experience.
Well, this does bring us back to the idea of the first-person embodied way of thinking about art that we talked about earlier. And that does bring up another thought for me, which is that you are a notoriously readable writer, and that has to do both with the beauty of your language, but also with the sense of personal stakes that you invest in art. But I think that lyrical and personal dimension can lead some people to underestimate or overlook the fact that I think that there is actually a theory underlying the way you approach your subject. And it has to do with, I think you approach art not with a jaded eye, but with an unsparing sense of human nature or artist nature, and a sense for piercing through some of the romantic mumbo jumbo around art, but as a method, as a way of passing through that to the sense of art or looking at art as a kind of wisdom, definitely not a general wisdom, but a quirky, specific, important way of looking at the world.
When I say a little frivolously, that I try not to take art too seriously. I am very goddamn serious about what I do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very serious about the writing, and it can't only sound good, It has to have some actual thought in it, and it's never thought that I had before I started the piece. It's a process of feeling and thinking until I can't think of how to make it any better.
Here we are in this crazy moment, and I'm not a big fan of, the art and coronavirus essay kind of piece, but I did appreciate this most recent essay you wrote called Mortality in the Old Masters. And I mean, I just thought it had a really organic way of wrestling.
Thank you. That was easy to write. It only took me about a month of daily agonies. I guess one of the mixed blessings that you got a lot of time to do things. And of course, I had it's been quite a year for me. In the fall, I was diagnosed with lung cancer and given almost no time to live. And I wrote about that. And then the treatment has been a miracle. And then my wife and my apartment of 47 years on St. Mark's Place burned out with a fire. So I don't know. Everything seems to be encouraging me to think about deep, dark things. And then I did have that chance in December of going to Madrid and spending days in the Prado, which is my favorite place.
Have you always had that kind of connection with old master paintings?
I didn't get Rembrandt until I was close to 40. I think most people don't. You have to have lived, because it's about, the residue of the content of being alive. And when you're a kid, you don't know anything about that. And my thing about the old masters, first of all, I knew nothing about them. And I saw their work before I knew anything about them. The Frick was terrific. In the 60s, it was free. You could walk in anytime. There are generally very few people there. There are no labels, just the artist's name, right? So I fell in love with these paintings one after another before I knew anything about Vermeer or Rembrandt or Veronese.
You just went in blind?
Yeah. I looked at the pictures. I mean, that's what you do. And then if you're excited, then you learn, right? And then you're driven to learn. And then if you have to write about it, of course, you're going to learn. I like to say that most of what I know about art history was learned on deadlines.
Yeah, I identify with that too.
I think it's a great way to learn because you end up with no excess knowledge. You go to school and they screw off the top of your head and they pour all this stuff in it, right? And you don't know whether it's going to come in handy or not. But in my situation, it was like I know things because they came in handy, because I needed them right then. And but the thing about the old masters is you can't use them up, right? You can keep going back to them. And and as, modern art and modernism kicks in and the world speeds up, you get things that wear out a lot faster. Since the 60s, it's like American artists have become disposable napkins, really interesting for 6 months. Which, by the way, I don't sneeze at. I'm not against fashion. I think fashion is a device. It's an apparatus for living in the moment and not to be taken seriously at all, except that it's like a mechanism of what we're paying attention to at the moment.
Yeah.
Right? And if we didn't have it, we'd have to know everything all the time. It's like a spotlight that's shifting. I mean, to become fashionable is to be doomed, you know?
Well, I was homeschooled, and I remember when I started high school, I remember like having this vivid feeling that like all the other kids had this secret language, of like pop culture references and stuff. And so I always think that that's one feature of culture, that it just connects you to other people, like that's the kind of fashion.
Well, that's the whole thing of culture. Culture is the answer to what we're doing here, and how we can be together. It's the how of existence. And, it had better be fun to some extent.
The reading of modernism that you just mentioned, of that time speeds up and art changes, I feel like that's the pretty normal reading. What I hadn't heard is from this most recent essay, you make this point about the experience of mortality.
The passing of a fashion is like a little death, little bit of death, and the necessity, really, of a critic when he or she is young, which I am not anymore, is to be where things are happening, so as not to miss things that are going to be short-lived. I mean, there are things that have a lot of juice and drama and comedy in them that aren't going to last a year, that will be forgotten. You've got to be there. I think there's a fair amount of that in my writing, of catching things when they're hot.
I was wondering if, I kept coming back to, you wrote this essay called The Art of Dying, got your diagnosis last year.
Yeah. It was terrific. I started writing it after I got my diagnosis. And I didn't know what I was writing. It was really like going back 35 years being a poet. It was, I didn't think I'd publish it. I didn't know what the hell it was, But thinking that I'm dying, I realized it immediately. What the gift was is that I could step out of myself, right? I'm summing up this character, who I happen to know quite a bit about. And also I wanted to do jokes. I was collecting death jokes for a while. And my daughter, Ada, at one point read the draft and said, "Dad, too many rim shots, take them out." And then when the treatment kicked in and it became clear that I was going to survive, I couldn't write it anymore.
I guess I did want to ask you about one paragraph that stood out to me, because the whole essay is sort of like Peter Schjeldahl writing a Peter Schjeldahl essay about Peter Schjeldahl. There's a turn through biography, and there are reflections on what it all means, and there's even some unsparing assessment and evaluation in there. But this one paragraph, I think, did stand out to me because, again, it was a reflection a little bit on method and the theory underneath it all. You say, "I retain but suspend my personal taste to deal with the panoply of the art I see. I have a trick for doing justice to an uncongenial work. What would I like about this if I liked it? I may come around, I may not. Failing that, I wonder, what must the people who like this be like? Anthropology." And that was that word, anthropology. What does that mean?
Oh, the thing about what I like if I like this, I realized I was doing that. I mean, it's like, otherwise, what am I? I'm a judge, In the course of being a critic, I'm writing about a lot of things I don't like very much, but I don't think they're chopped liver, and they mean something to somebody, and that's interesting. So it's like I kind of make myself a lawyer for this stuff. And see where that goes. Damien Hirst, I'm hopeless. I absolutely end up thinking, who the fuck likes this? But also, I also said in there that I have the two main criteria of quality and significance. How good is it? And what does it matter? And things can matter a lot without being very good. And things can be wonderfully good and not matter very much.
Right. So Like you said, this has been quite a year for you, even before it proved to be quite a year for the rest of us.
One friend just wrote to me and said that after I got all of that praise for my death essay, suddenly everybody in the world is under the threat, and that must piss me off a lot. No.
Has all that changed your way of thinking about what you do or looking at the world?
Oh, gee, it's tremendous effect. I mean, being conscious of death and having come to terms with it. I'm still on terms with it. You know, I worked that through, and it doesn't bother me. Whenever you can admit to in yourself, you can then immediately see in the world. You know, there's a kind of gravitas, the kind of seriousness that is invested in Velasquez Las Meninas that didn't occur to me. I mean, because it's so great, but that being in this situation broke me up to it. And I mean, the old masters. I mean, you know, why are they old? I mean, you know, why haven't we used them up after centuries? It's because we're still not there yet. I mean, we're not where they were yet, and they're waiting for us up ahead.
That seems like as fine a place as any to end our conversation today. Thank you so much, Peter, for taking the time to talk to me. It really has been a tremendous pleasure.
Thanks, Ben. It's been fun.
That's it for this week's episode of The Art Angle. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manoli, Tim Schneider, and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.